Now notice that in some sense when we talk about substituting industrialization, the government was heavily involved in picking industries to protect, what kind of trade policies to put into place, how to allocate capital, because remember we got capital market imperfections as well. And we often had all sorts of other rules and regulations, so the government was heavily involved. The East Asian economic miracle has generally been thought of as an area where, with the exception of China, where the government has really had somewhat of a hands-off approach. So we want to look at that. We also want to ask, okay, are Asian government bureaucrats really that much better than bureaucrats in other developing parts of the world? And is there anything else that accounts for the success that we've seen of these Asian countries? So let's talk about the trade policy first. What we do know is, as I said, the trade policies were very export-oriented. Both exports and imports had high ratios to GDP. Notice that's exactly the opposite of what you would expect from import substituting industrialization, right? If you're limiting your imports, your import ratio is going to go down. But if you don't import anything, you don't export very much either. So import substitution drives import and export ratios down, where export promotion actually drives those ratios up. So just having that kind of an orientation suggests that those ratios will be very high. So we saw those high ratio of exports and imports and high growth rates in these economies. But we also want to say how much of that was due to free trade policies. And the fact of the matter is, if you look across that whole list of Asian economies, you will find a huge spectrum of different kinds of trade policies. Hong Kong forever seems to have had the most open economic policy in terms of international trade. As few trade policies as probably possible in any economy. South Korea is not that way at all, nor was Taiwan in the early years. Both have become more open, fewer trade policies in the last 10 or 15 years, but during the first 2 decades of their rapid growth, they had big trade policies in place. They had things like tariffs and import quotas on imports. They also used export subsidies as well as production subsidies, both directly for producing as well as subsidized loans. China clearly uses all of those strategies as well as undervalued currencies. So we have a whole variety of different types of policies that have been followed. However, even with that said, what we can say is that these Asian economies much closer to free trade than other developing countries. So the way to think about that is, yes, the Asian economies had trade policies that caused all sorts of distortions, but the trade policies and the distortions themselves were much, much smaller than we saw elsewhere in the world. Again, here's an example of that. You can see that for the Asian economies, 24% effective tariff rates, but if you looked at South Asia and South America, you saw rates that were not quite double that. So we had many, many more issues there. And Sub-Saharan Africa has other issues. We also need to ask ourselves whether big increases in trade caused faster economic growth, or did faster economic growth cause a big increase in international trade? So if you have your export to GDP ratio going up, we know that GDP is consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus exports. So if exports are growing faster, we know GDP will grow faster. But we've also seen earlier that if you had export biased growth, so the economy is growing, but it's growing in the direction of those industries where you have a comparative advantage, your exports are going to grow much more quickly anyway. So disentangling whether the trade caused the faster growth or the faster growth caused faster trade or greater trade is a very difficult one to untangle. And it's not clear as to exactly which is the cause and which is the effect. Now, industrial policies or government intervention outside of trade policy has also been one of those areas where the Asian economies seem to have gotten a big payoff. So industrial policies are all of those things that are over and above the trade policies that we do that might influence a particular industry, including production subsidies, tax credits for research and development, or government-provided research and development, or government-sponsored industrial espionage. I do not mean that tongue-in-cheek. I'm actually serious about that. Industrial secrets get stolen all the time. So, but it might also be special financing, or financing at well below market interest rates. Or, not to pick on China, we'll give you a loan, by the way, wink and nod, we don't really expect you to pay us back, but use it to expand your business. So all of those types of policies would come under this heading of industrial policies. Again, if we thought about these kinds of policies coming from the government, and whether that's been a big issue in terms of these Asian economies' performances, we'd have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. First of all, wide range of policies. Again, from very heavily managed and structured economies, China in the 1990s, South Korea in the 1970s, Singapore most of the time at one extreme, at the other extreme, places like Hong Kong almost all the time, Thailand more recently, Malaysia more recently, Taiwan more recently, much less government involvement in the types of things that are going on. So when you have a relatively uniform outcome, but a variety of different policies that are going in, it's hard to say that those policies going in are what accounted for the outcome that was taking place. A second reason why we may be skeptical is what we think of as the industrial structure of the economy has not been all that different between different countries. So what we mean by the industrial structure of an economy is what proportion of it is, say, low-level manufacturing, textiles and apparel, for instance. What percentage of the economy is in agriculture? What percentage of the economy is in food processing? What percentage of the economy is in automobiles or transport equipment, or this industry or that industry? And what we find, quite frankly, is there isn't that much difference between the larger of the countries. So when we think of Taiwan and South Korea and Japan and China and Malaysia and Thailand, Indonesia, the industrial structures aren't dramatically different from one another, even though the industrial policies that have been adopted have clearly favored some industries much more so over other industries. And then finally, even though there have been some great success stories from what are thought of as industrial policies, there have also been some notable failures. My best example, or the one I think is most humorous, is in the late 1950s, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan decided that there was absolutely no way that Japan could compete in the global automobile market. and they refused to provide any financing or research and development efforts to the Japanese car companies. Oops, I think they missed that one. Okay, now it turns out very happily for the Japanese in that case, because while the government didn't subsidize them, the companies came back anyway, and obviously they are world-class competitors today. But we've seen lots of industries that have been subsidized by the government in one way or the other that just have never become particularly effective in a global environment. So we might look, if it's not trade policies, or not exclusively trade policies, and it's not industrial policies, or at least not exclusively industrial policies, what else can account for the fact that we might have had rapid economic growth in this part of the world, where we've also seen a huge increase on the export side, and, by the way, on the import side. So we can think about these other factors. And one of the things that you might remember from your macroeconomics in the Solow growth model, does everybody remember Solow growth model? I didn't say fondly, I just said, do you remember your Solow growth model? So if you think about, the whole Solow growth model was a framework for thinking about, yes, go for it. So in the Solow growth model, it provides us with a framework for thinking about how countries can grow over long periods of time. So that's really what we're talking about with all of these Asian economies. So what are some of the things that would make faster economic growth within the context of that Solow model? Well, one would be we have to have very high savings rates, which almost all of these countries have. They all had high savings rates, some of them very high savings rates. There were also great strides or great increases in public education. Literacy, numeracy expanded quite dramatically in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, setting the stage for much more rapid growth later. Remember, technology or productivity gains come in part from your degree of human capital, and that's in large part public education or education. So we also had faster productivity growth. One of the things most of these countries were open to, not all, but most of these countries were open to, was foreign direct investment. So by allowing multinational firms to come in and set up their own operations, one of the things that happens when a multinational comes in, it brings the latest and greatest technology, managerial skills, financial skills, the whole bit also comes along with it. So while you may use a different production process, making something in China than making it in the United States, the technology and productivity aspects are still there within the same company. All of these countries also had much faster labor force growth. That faster labor force growth rarely was part of faster population growth, but rather by increases in labor force participation rates. So a larger percentage of the adult population was actually in the workforce during this growth spurt than was the case elsewhere. So I think that the conclusion that I draw from this and looking at the evidence is that there's no single cause that you can put your finger on that is going to explain all, or for that matter, even most of the truly miraculous economic performance that we've seen out of the East Asian countries over the last 50 years. I don't know that it's unique. I don't know that if other countries followed the same sorts of things, very high savings rates, spread public education, tried to promote inward foreign direct investment, that you would get the same outcome. But it does look as if these countries did follow a menu of approaches, checking off more liberalized trade policies, not free trade, but more liberalized trade policies, some industrial policies that had broader scopes, and in some cases were very fortunate that they picked winners, and following the sort of traditional long-term growth strategies that almost any macroeconomist would promote anyway. The still unanswered question, looking at the data, is still, was the faster economic growth the result or the cause of faster export growth, and therefore that export orientation? That knot still hasn't been severed yet. So we don't know the answer to that, and you'll get conflicting opinions on either side. The one thing that we can say, we have many more success stories from an export orientation approach than we do from an import substitution approach when we think about economic development. And in fact, one of the interesting things, as I mentioned earlier, one of the countries that was probably the poster child of import substituting policies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even through the 80s, India, is finally and slowly shedding that import substituting policy and moving to an export orientation. And one of the things that we've seen in the last 10 years, faster growth out of India during that period of time than at any time we had seen in the prior 40 years. So it does appear as if export orientation is much more viable as a way of achieving more rapid economic development than import substitution. Okay, so what are we doing next time? I don't remember, something. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday.